Afternoon, everyone. My name's Mark Siebentritt from Edge Environment. Just going to wait for another minute or two for a few more people to join us before we get going. We've already had one session this morning, which is fantastic. A lot of great engagements and fascinating questions. So looking forward to another session this afternoon. So we'll probably wait for about one more minute and then we're to get ourselves underway.
While we're waiting, feel free to pop in the chat box who you are and where you're from.
It's a great idea, Jenny. I think this morning we had people from the east coast of Australia, someone from New Zealand, and also someone from Oregon in the US. So a pretty diverse group, which was fantastic. Oh, here we go.
Welcome, Joanne. Are you with Perth Council or who are you with in Perth?
It's always odd doing the sessions like this, Jenny, when you can't actually directly speak to people. So it's a bit of a different setup, isn't it? Look, we're 3 minutes.
Oh, Sterling, nice.
Oh, great. So we're a couple of minutes past the start time. So I think we'll get ourselves underway. We know that we've got a smaller group. There was about 20, 25 people registered for this afternoon. I know a few people aren't able to make it anymore, so I think we'll just get cracking and jump into it. So once again, thank you and welcome. Thanks for coming along today. This afternoon, Jenny and I are really excited to be able to talk with you about the Tree Planting Predictor and the progress we've made. It's been a journey over a couple of years now to get to this point, but we're really excited to be able to talk about the light version of the tool, which is available freely online, as well as the professional version of the tool. And really today is designed to give you a bit of a walkthrough and say what are the types of things that can be achieved with using the tools. And, you know, Jenny will reiterate this in a few moments, but we're very big on the evidence base behind greening. And we recognise as people are, I suppose, personally and professionally passionate about urban greening and its importance to the future of creating livable cities, we know that we need a really solid evidence base behind those urban greening strategies in order to be able to get the resources and really the funding needed to make it happen. So basically today will be a little bit more from me up front, then we'll hand over to Jenny to talk through some of the global context around greening before we start to jump into a hypothetical, which we'll use to unpack how the Tree Planting Predictor performs. Before we continue though, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners from all the lands from where everyone's coming together today. Myself here, I'm based in Adelaide, so I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, who are the traditional owners of the Adelaide Plains, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So to kick things off, Jenny, I'll hand back over to you to talk with us through what's happening with livable cities at a global level.
Thanks, Mark. So the next few slides are really just setting the context. I'm sure it's not going to be anything new to anyone here, but just to make sure we're all on the same page and moving forward together from the same spot. So there's definitely the global trend at the moment for urban areas is to create livable cities and how to create livable cities. And really a livable city requires a balance between economy, social and also environment. And when it comes to sort of how cities are created to be more livable, there's it's widely acknowledged now, if you can hop onto the next slide, Mark, that a key mechanism is growing urban forests. So whilst greening the city in general is really important, urban trees are recognised and acknowledged to have a huge range of benefits, which is why there's this massive focus on planting more trees and growing the canopy cover in the urban forest. And this is recognised by a wide range of leading international and national organisations such as the World Health Organisation, the UN's FAO, and in Australia, places like the National Heart Foundation all recognise the real value and the benefit of urban trees. So what we've been finding then is in response to this sort of acknowledged benefit of urban trees, on the next slide, we see that there's a growing number of cities that are really committing to growing their urban forests. And this is seen through organisations such as Tree Cities of the World, with this last year 120 cities now being recognised as a Tree City of the World. And to be recognised as a Tree City of the World, you have to demonstrate compliance with 5 core criteria. And the criteria really relate to ensuring that you have set canopy targets and you have policies in place which show your commitment to protecting and growing and managing the urban forest, but also engaging the community around the urban forest. So it's a growing movement happening at the city scale, and this city scale is so important. And on the next slide, there's a headline I found that out of COP26 even, which recognise that it's cities that are driving the conversation of climate change adaptation and this sort of thing, not necessarily countries. So what's the first thing then that we find and we see cities doing in response to this need to grow the urban forest? The first thing that often happens is a canopy cover target is set. It's endorsed and that's sort of the goal. And these are often very ambitious targets, which is fantastic. So if you have a look, for example, Melbourne and Sydney, both have targets to nearly double their canopy cover over the next 20 years. But if you have a look at Kampala City, Capital City Authority in Uganda, which is one of the this year's most recent Tree Cities of the World, they're also aiming to double their canopy cover, but they're aiming to do that within the next 5 years. So you get these very ambitious targets being set. And that's all well and good. But then what we find is when it comes to implementation and really getting down onto the ground level, onto the next slide, Mark, it's not so easy as just setting the target and go ahead and plant trees and you shall achieve it. We find very commonly a set of challenges that we're hearing from our clients and from other councils and land managers around, oh my goodness, how do we meet these targets? You know, how many trees do we actually need to plant? You know, what sort of mix of species should we be using? Do we actually have the space available to achieve our canopy cover targets? What realistically is this going to cost us? And how do we really get this support for growing the canopy, growing the urban forest and the funding that will be needed? How do we get the support both internally from elected members, but also externally from the community? And so it was in response to these sort of common questions that we were hearing a lot that we started really developing the Tree Planting Predictor, because we recognised on the next slide that there's a real need for an evidence base to sit behind your canopy cover targets. So if you click through those few points there, it's not just as simple as set the target or having common goals even, but really there's this evidence base required to demonstrate to community and elected members what's really needed to achieve targets, and that really helps to leverage support but also funding. And that leads into our tree planting predictor. Hand back to Mark.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. I was just admiring the energy efficient booth that I'm sitting in, which is automatically turning the light on and off, which is not ideal. So if I disappear, I'll try to move around again and get the light going. But as Jenny said, and I suppose I iterated right at the start, is the evidence base behind greening is really important to us. And I suppose it's important to us because it's the exact sort of question we've been asked when we're out doing our work, whether it's with councils or developers or other land managers. And it's interesting just reflecting a little bit on how the Tree Planting Predictor came about. So it was around 2 years ago that we were doing some work with a council and preparing their urban forest strategy, presenting to a group of elected members, and a discussion around a quite ambitious tree canopy target had taken off. And all of a sudden, one of the councillors said, hang on, do we know how much that's going to cost us to achieve that target? And within that, how many trees we need to plant to get there? And we perhaps naively said, oh, that's easy. That's a simple calculation. We'll get back to you next week on that. So that was about 2 years ago. And really what's happened in the last couple of years is we've gradually been building up this tool using an Excel platform to the point now where we've got the light and the professional version of the tool, the latter of those being in its second version. So this is really in response to a whole range of questions and feedbacks we've been getting from the organisations we work with. And really, if we boil it down, the objective of the Tree Planting Predictors provide the evidence base for achievable canopy cover targets. And what's really important is it's set up and designed to enable you to be able to explore different planting program scenarios. And that's got a quite specific meaning to us. So in any given scenario, we're interested in what's the species mix, what's the number of trees planted per year, and also is there irrigation happening or not? And we know, particularly in dry climates, that where we do or don't have irrigation, that can lead to a massive difference in, for a given tree species, the amount of tree canopy you get in the future, and also how long it takes a tree to get there. So we dig a little bit further down. The other types of information we want is what's the future achievable canopy cover target and when can you get there? What's the cost of getting there? Often we'll talk about big ambitious targets and they clearly make sense from an ecosystem services perspective, but we all know that you've got to be able to have the resources to get there as well. So cost is really significant. I've touched on irrigation and we've also mentioned the impact of different species mixes. So all those factors are quite important. Jenni, I'll hand back to you now to just talk us through the 7 different inputs that are required to feed into the tool.
Thanks, Mark. I'll go mute. That'll help. So when we run a tree planting predictor model, there are these 7 key inputs, and where the inputs come from can vary. You might already have them available. It might be something that we can help you develop, and there are, various sources and approaches that can be taken to get this input data if you don't already have it. So, don't worry if you're looking at these inputs thinking we don't have it, therefore we can't do this tool. So we can definitely help there. So the first is an understanding of your current canopy cover. So obviously if we're trying to see whether a target's realistic or how you're going to achieve a target, we really need to know where you're starting from. So understanding your current canopy cover, and then also understanding your already endorsed canopy cover target, or potentially you're still investigating canopy cover targets and there might be 2 or 3 different targets that you'd like to investigate. The second is understanding the area of interest. So we really need to know where, what's the size of the area that you're trying to achieve these canopy cover targets within. The third is looking at tree growth parameters and the planting mix. So what this is really talking about is how do different trees grow in your specific context. And this is something that through the process of doing a tree planting predictor project, we work specifically with your arboricultural, your horticultural team, your planners, your field officers, people who really know how trees grow and survive and respond in your local context. So we help develop the tree growth parameters, and then also have a look at the planting mix, which is really talking about what proportion in your planting programs will be comprised of smaller canopy versus larger canopy trees. The fourth input is understanding your current establishment success. And again, this is where having your local team who really know what happens in your local context is so important. So understanding from past planting programs, how many of those trees planted actually make it through the establishment phase and grow into mature trees. On the flip side, the 5th input is your rate of loss. So this is looking at your current canopy cover and understanding trends in loss over time. So this could be due to tree senescence or diseases or storms, but more often in urban areas, it's as a result of urban infill. And that's something that can be modelled over time. So we get an idea of rate of loss. The 6th input then is, as we've already mentioned, your irrigation. So will you be irrigating? Won't you be irrigating? For how many years do you plan to irrigate? All those sorts of things. So we get the context specific, again, customization around irrigation. And then finally, it's the establishment cost. So what does it cost you on average to plant a tree and then manage that tree through its initial establishment phase? And that can vary from council to council, obviously. And so that's why it's important that we get an idea of your local context establishment costs.
Thanks, Jenny. I think one of the really key points there is around the tree growth parameters in the planting mix. And that really drives a lot of the formulas that sit in the tree planting predictors. So really what we see is in both the professional and the light version, there's a front-end dashboard where you can get in and manipulate some key input variables. And we'll talk a little bit further in a few moments around what the different types of functionality are between those. But then there's a series of back-end calculations. And this is forever growing as we improve the complexity and the functionality of the tool. But at the moment, there's over 500,000 equations which sit in the back-end sheets that drive this. And ultimately, we're looking at moving towards a web-based platform, which is something we'll expand on in a few moments' time. But I really want to focus a bit more on the way the tree growth parameters work. And the way that we have tackled those S-shaped growth curves is really to use what's called a multi-partite analysis, whereby we break down the different parts of the growth curve of the tree, and then we can get in there and assign different rates of growth to features such as, in particular, the extent of canopy at the end of the growth period, and also how long it takes to get to the point of having a mature canopy. So there are these 5 categories of trees, and this is the way that we've tackled, rather than having to train up the tool with, say, 200 tree curves for individual species, and then knowing that each species will have a different growth curve depending on where you are. We'll set it up in a way that can be customized. And I'll come back to that customization in a few moments. But the 5 categories of trees, the first category is basically small trees. In this case here, we've got an example of a crepe myrtle. Then we have our category B trees. We've got a photo here of a callistemon, which is pretty common in many suburban areas in Australia. A category C tree could be or is equivalent to a yellow gum, so something that's 8 meters tall. Also, and we were discussing this with some New Zealand contacts recently, you can also use trees from other geographical locations. So for example, here, we've got the equivalent of what would be a category C in New Zealand, which is a coastal mare. In category D, the same thing. So in category D, we've got, that's not a yellow gum, that's a Norfolk Island pine, for those who are watching closely, or we've got a rata, which is an equivalent of a category D or a medium to large tree in a New Zealand context. And then our category E trees are really quite large trees. So key points here being they get a large canopy, but they also take a long time to get to that large canopy. And so you'll see what we're trying to achieve here is being able to group up the trees that grow in a given area into those that might be smaller with a small canopy but grow quickly, compared to those which are larger trees, larger canopy, but also take longer to get to that canopy. I mentioned earlier on about the customization, and Jenny's also touched on this, and it's a really significant part of the way the tool works. So when we first open it up, it's pre-programmed with assumptions around the size of trees at planting, the size of the canopy once they reach maturity, and how long it takes to get to maturity. However, the way it's designed to be used is you actually then customize those parameters for your given location. And I always love to use the example of a jacaranda. So we know that a jacaranda growing in Auckland will grow at a slightly different rate than if it was growing, for example, in Brisbane or Adelaide or someone that might be in the semi-arid zone. And so the tool's designed to enable you to go in and for different categories of trees to be able to tweak and modify those tree growth parameters, which then adjust the S-shaped curves that are sitting in the back end of the tool. So the idea is it's customizable. The other thing we find is that this is a really powerful way of getting engagement from arboriculture teams, from hort teams, from open space planners, so that it's really quite transparent. There's not a black box going on here in terms of how the tool operates. So what we want to do now is move on to our case study. So our case study is a hypothetical one. It's the city of Greenway. So the city of Greenway, our hypothetical example, is a major urban capital with a population of about 1.5 million, which is rapidly growing. And this is a community that's grappling with issues similar to what many of you around the call this afternoon are dealing with. So how do you balance up the desire for economic prosperity and growth with also delivering social and environmental outcomes and making sure we've got a community that's resilient to the future of climate change. And this community has recognised that growing the urban forest is really important for achieving that balance. Also, this community is undergoing, or the council's undergoing, internal and external pressure to act and grow that urban forest. And they want to set an ambitious target of 30% canopy cover by 2030. And we'll let you in on what they currently sit at in a few moments. And so really what they're doing, the challenge they're facing, is they need to implement a planting strategy, but there's a fair bit of a lack of clarity around exactly how many trees do they need to plant each year to meet their target. Where do they prioritise those plantings, and how much will it cost? And these are all the sorts of questions that the Tree Planting Predictor can help answer. And I can see there's a few questions starting to come through in the chat function, so we'll absolutely come to those towards the end of the session. So input data, Jenni ran through the types of input data earlier on, but this is what we've set up this case study for with the City of Greenway. You'll see that the tool is designed to be able to handle multiple canopy targets. So we don't want to just run with one target. We found through testing of the tool through time, often the organisations we work with want to run multiple scenarios. And so we'll tend to have a scenario which is a little bit below in terms of canopy target, a little bit below what they're really aiming for, and then one that's a little bit above. We've got the current area here of 65 square kilometres. Their current canopy cover is 19.8%. So they've got a bit of work to do to get from either 19.8 up to 25 or even 30 or 35%. Establishment access, really, really important. And the results of the Tree Planting Predictor show that when you're looking at how many trees you need to plant, you also need to factor in what is your establishment success. And it goes without saying that the more accessible establishment is, the fewer trees you need to plant in any given year. We've got an inherent rate of loss built in. We're looking at irrigation. We've also got an establishment cost. Now, for the way the tool is set up for use in the hypothetical here, we're assuming an establishment cost of $650 per tree. We've typically found in organisations we've worked with and using the tool so far that the establishment cost ranges from $500 up into the $600 per tree. However, we also know that if you're looking at, for example, putting strata cells in the middle of large cities, then that could cost you anywhere up to $10,000 a tree. So that's all the sort of thing that can be tailored in the way the tool is set up. And then we've noted here that we have plantable space of 30%. In terms of the planting mix, this is another one of those factors that the Tree Planting Predictor really shows is quite critical in your ability to meet your future canopy cover target. So we've got two species mixes here. The first one here is more orientated towards small to medium trees. So you'll see that 90% of our trees are either categories A, B, or C, whereas we do a subtle shift in species mix B and have a few more trees out in those medium to large categories. But what you'll see later on is that makes actually quite a profound impact on the time that it takes to reach our future canopy cover target. But this is another set of assumptions that goes into the tool. Before I jump in and actually show you the tools in action, thought we'd look at the functionality, the light versus the professional version. So the light has really got three main areas that you can manipulate or modify. The first is the current area. So what's the area of land mass you're dealing with? What's your current canopy cover? And also what are the number of trees that you're planting either in irrigated areas or non-irrigated areas? The light version also has 4 canopy targets that are already locked in, whereas the professional version has the full functionality opened up. One of the reasons we actually developed the light version is we're getting questions from organisations who wanted to run this tool with their community, and they wanted to be able to have a light version that they could test different scenarios with. So really responding to some of the feedback and the queries we'd had around how the tool operates. So let's jump now into the online version. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing and we'll go back into the online version. So you'll see on that slide deck before that the Tree Planting Predictor is available through the Edge website. Effectively come into the landing page here and we get down towards the bottom where we just enter our details. So I'll do that now just to show you that it doesn't take too long to do.
I've also put a link to the light version of the tool into the chat if anyone wants to access it from there.
So a couple of seconds and bang, we're in. And this is effectively the light version. It's a little bit of a background blurb on how it operates, but there's those areas that we can manipulate. So we can come in here, for example, we can change the total area in there. We can change our current canopy. Let's change that to 20%. Hit calculate. The wheels turn in the background. And then we can also look at what are the number of trees required or that can be planted each year. In this case here, we'll do 100 there. We'll keep that one at 75. We hit calculate. So you can see it doesn't take very long. And what it does is it starts to generate these projected curves of the total cumulative canopy. Effectively, what it's doing is it's showing you with these dashed lines what the target canopy level is. And then we look at our base canopy in the beige color. Gray is what we get just with our non-irrigated trees. And then the green is what we get with our irrigated trees. And you can see, you can start to look at what's the year at which the curves, the cumulative canopy curves, intersect with the target curves. This one here is interesting, and the way I quickly configured that is it's showing a lot of the canopy cover can be achieved fairly rapidly within a period of anywhere from 6 through to 14 years. What we actually find is more often than not, the canopy cover targets aren't achieved until a much, I suppose, distant point in time. So that's a quick wander through the light version. Key point to note there is we're getting some great feedback from people who've been jumping in and using it. If you have any questions or feedback on this light version, please feel free to send us an email at tpp@edgeenvironment.com. What I'll do now is I'm going to head into the professional version or the full version that I mentioned. And we'll now zoom in a little bit so you can see the way some of it's set up. It's all relatively self-explanatory. So we have what our current scenario is at the top here. So that's our current area, our current canopy in terms of meters squared. So we're setting up how does a landscape currently appear, including our net annual loss. We've got our targets that we're setting for either for the entire council area, or we also like to look at targets as they relate to different tenure types. And for those of you working in local government, you'll immediately realise why that's important, because often there's a lot of pressure, one could say, put on councils to deliver future canopy growth. And yet the reality is they don't actually have the majority of the land in a given LGA. And so we like to break that up in terms of a tenure analysis. We've got our tree growth parameters, which in the full version are completely able to be changed. So we can change our time to maturity or the crown spread at maturity, both in non-irrigated and irrigated trees. And then we run a series of different scenarios down the bottom here, which are really focused on for a given number of trees that are planted per year, how does that split out across different tenure scenarios? As I whip around here, if we're moving on the right-hand side of the dashboard, what we see here is the cumulative canopy cover for the scenario that we've plugged in. And once again, we've got our dashed lines here. They relate to the different targets of canopy cover. And then down the bottom right here, there's a few different ways of presenting some of the graphical outputs. But essentially, that is the front end of the tool. That's the version when we're running workshops that we're engaging with and we're modifying data in. Sitting behind that, we also have a planting schedule, so we can manipulate the number of trees planted per year over an extended period of time. And then we have breakout tabs as well relating to LGA, state land or private land. And then sitting in the background of all of this are the tree growth curves. So what I wanted to do now is spend a little bit of time just going back into the slide deck and showing you what the results of our hypothetical analysis have been, just to give you a bit of an insight into how the data comes up. Okay, so one of the things we found really useful in reporting is to be able to generate these types of graphs. So you'll see for the way we configured this is with that species mix A, 2,500 trees per year in the city of Greenway is not enough even to reach their lowest level of canopy growth or canopy target by even 2070. So it falls a long way short. 5,000 trees per year just gets you to your lower end target by 2053, but doesn't get their actual target of 30% even by 2070. What you see is the curve keeps coming forward. So we find all of a sudden that by 2044, you could achieve your 25% canopy cover target, and you can actually get to the target of 30% by about 2060. And really what you're seeing there is the impact of planting a different number of trees per year. I'm going to fast forward a little bit though and show you one of the ways we like to present this analysis when it is lumped up. And what you'll see here is different types of input variables being managed and presented in the one table. So in this part of the left-hand side here, we've got the number of trees planted per year, but the top half of the table is all about, for a given planting scenario, what year or how long does it take in order for you to be able to reach your different targets. Down the bottom of the table is what it's going to cost to get there. Now, the cost to get there, some of those numbers look pretty big, but it's important to know that, for example, if you're looking at a 2059 target, you're actually looking at nearly 40 years worth of investment in tree planting. So we're looking at over a long period of time. The key things to note here, also, we've got planting mix A and planting mix B, remembering that mix B has got a greater number of large trees, and then our targets are 25, 30, and 35%. The key message, though, is that with 2,500 trees per year on a planting mix A, you are never going to be able to reach, or this council would never reach any of those targets. Whereas if they're planting 7,500 trees per year, they could actually get at least 2 of those targets. But the interesting point is that when you start to introduce medium and larger trees into the mix, your ability to reach those canopy cover targets sooner becomes much greater. Now, while on one hand, that's intuitive, and you would think that is what would occur, what we're trying to do here with the tree planting predictor is be much more specific about when that might occur. So you'll see in this case here, for example, our shift between planting mix A and B, which is really about pushing 10% of the trees planted into those larger tree categories, it takes us 7 years less to get from our to our 25% target. And indeed, with 5,000 trees a year, but with planting mix B, you can achieve your canopy cover target by 2056. And then there's all the backup numbers here around the cost. So key message here is that by running multiple different scenarios through the tree planting predictor, you can really get some deep insights into the impact of different planting scenarios on your ability to meet future canopy cover targets. The final thing I'd note before, Jenny, I hand back over to you, is the significance and the importance of sensitivity testing. So the way the tool is currently being used is, and Jenny will explain this as well, it's done through a workshop setting. One of the reasons for that is that we find there's a lot of interest in what is actually driving the sensitivity of those future canopy levels. And it could be the number of trees per year, the species mix, the cost per tree. We've touched on those. But you can also start looking at, well, what happens if I modify my establishment success? And am I better off investing in planting more trees per year, or invest more in improving my establishment success? Equally, what's the impact of different rates of dieback? And one of the things that the tool really highlights is that even low levels of background dieback or reduction in canopy really have a very big impact on the number of trees that need to be planted. Noting, of course, those trees are starting off small, and you often may be putting in small trees as a consequence of large trees having been removed. So sensitivity testing is also really important. And Jenny, you're going to talk a little bit about the City of Port Adelaide Enfield example.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so we've been through our hypothetical City of Greenway example. So this is just a brief example of a real world application of the tool. And I'm just going to pop into the chat box that link there so you can access that report yourselves if you're interested in delving into it in further detail in your own time. So the City of Port Adelaide Enfield is a city in the western suburbs of the Adelaide metro area. And we ran the tree planting predictor tool for them to help them really investigate the feasibility of targets and what it would take to achieve their canopy cover targets. And as with our hypothetical example, we had 2 planting mixes, with planting mix A really being dominated by those smaller canopied trees, and planting mix B including more of your larger canopied trees. We had 5 different number of tree scenarios being planted each year. And when we modelled those out, and we were modelling as well across different land tenures, but when we modelled that out, we found that, you know, for planting mix A, so your smaller canopy trees are dominating, they weren't possible to achieve a 35% or a 70% increase within the time frame that we'd model. So it would take much longer than 2070, if at all, for them to achieve those targets. They could achieve a 20% increase by 2058. But what you'd see is that by increasing the number of trees planted each year in that planting mix A to 7,500, they can actually achieve that 20% increase 20 years earlier. And if you have a look over into planting mix B, we can see that actually even with 2,500 trees, just by having some larger trees thrown into the mix, they're able to achieve even a 35% increase by 2057, which is around the same amount of time that they're able to achieve a 20% increase using the smaller planting mix. So this has been really valuable information, and it was actually, this information was then combined with another tool that we have to help them prioritise their plantings, which then gave them some really powerful information around how many trees needed to be planted, what the cost would be, and then prioritising a 5-year planting program for them. And that was really successful for them. They were able to, as a result of this outputs, to advocate and to justify for additional funding to support their tree planting program, and also to gain extra staff support in implementing the tree planting programs. So when we talk about implementing a tree planting predictor project, sorry about that. I've just got the cat here at home. It's just fallen off the table and pulled everything with it. But anyway, so when we're implementing a project, just to give you an idea of how that might look, basically we'd start with a request for information from you. So getting an idea from you about what input data, so which of those 7 input data categories you already have available, and what we might need to help you build on in order to flesh out any of that input data. The next step would be an initial workshop. And as we mentioned, it's really important to have involved in that workshop your key staff who are involved with the planting and planning. And during that workshop, it's really a case of providing an introduction to the tool to all the attendees, and then working with people in the workshop to customise the input data specific to your local context. So that's things like talking about those tree growth parameters, which trees that you plant fit into those different 5 categories, having a look at your planting costs and your irrigation schedules. And then from that, we would be defining your planting program scenarios that you'd like modelled. So that's having a look at the number of trees, the planting mix, and any irrigation. And those would be the scenarios that we would then go away and model, and then come back in a second workshop with those modelling outputs, where with the same people from workshop 1, we'd sit down and review the outputs. And that's where it gets really interesting, when we can really start to refine some of the planting program scenarios, so that we can get outputs that are going to work for your goals and your local context. We've talked a lot about, working with this tool with councils, local land managers, who realistically may only want to use the tool once every 2 or 3 years, for example, to establish planting programs and then to revise them. For example, when we launched the light version of the tool, somewhat surprisingly, I think, to Mark and myself, but a really good surprise, was the level of interest we started receiving from potential users of the tool outside of councils and local land managers. So we've had interest from developers who are really keen and see use in the tool being used multiple times through each year across many of their developments. There's also interest potentially for landscape architects. There's a really nice link in with the nurseries, so being able to understand how many trees you may be needing in each year to achieve your targets, and then making sure that the nurseries are able to be providing that supply, and then also applications with some community groups as well.
Great. That's back over to me, Jenny.
Yes.
So one of the questions we've been asked quite a lot in the last few weeks since the light version went up is, can it work with other tools, or is it effectively in competition with other tools? I think from our perspective, it's very much part of the ecosystem of tools that are needed to manage an urban forest and to build the evidence base. And we really see that it's very, very complementary. So just some examples of the types of tools that it could work in with. One of them is the street tree prioritizer, which we've been developing ourselves. That effectively looks at how many planting opportunities there are within a given area of land, and then what the priorities are for planting based on information around social vulnerability, urban heat and current canopy cover. And fundamentally, that's all about the space for planting, but you still want to be able to know for a given planting area, how many trees, or when you plant a given number of trees, what the future canopy cover is. So even if you're looking at generating maps around priority areas for planting, still being able to bring that back to what's a planting schedule look like, and then what's the future canopy likelihood for that is really valuable information. Target's another really good example of it's an urban heat simulation tool, which was developed by the CRC for water sensitive cities. I think it's got a lot of great applications at a city scale. What it does is it enables a user to look at changing the canopy cover in the tool. One of the questions it doesn't necessarily help answer, though, is how many trees do you need to plant to achieve that change in canopy? And that's where the TPP can help out. Tree asset management systems, there's some great tree asset management systems being developed. Forestry is one example. There's a brilliant job being done with putting forestry together. We see that the TPP and tools like forestry as being completely complementary, as well as a tool like Which Plant Where, which has been developed with the support of Hort Innovation, and a stand is closing in on a release date. So absolutely, the TPP is a sort of tool that we would fully expect can be used alongside these tools and a range of other tools that are commonly used by those out there doing strategic planning in the open space area. In terms of ongoing development, we've been really, I suppose, excited in the feedback we've been getting around where we've got to, and some of the things we're now looking at is a SaaS solution, so software as a service, whereby some users are saying they may want to apply the tool up to 20 or 30 times per year. So we're looking at a different model and way that those types of users can engage with the tool. Effectively, there'd be training on offer, and then they could apply that in themselves. We're also exploring now how to build in carbon sequestration estimates. So for a given planting program, not only what the future canopy would be, but what the sequestered carbon would be associated with that planting program. And we're also exploring providing a different and a broader range of tree growth parameters. And a little footnote and a plug is we're currently working away at a national report, national in terms of Australia, and we're looking at how many trees would need to be planted in each of Australia's capital cities to reach a canopy cover of 30%. And the idea is that's really, it's a high-level analysis, but it's an analysis that we hope will be, and it's just something we're doing off our own back to contribute to the debate on this issue around Australia. It's something we hope will provide some insights into the number of trees we need to continue to plant in our cities. One last thing before we go to the questions is how to get involved. So we've always been interested in developing case studies as a way of testing the tool and demonstrating it in different communities. We've currently got discussions undergoing in New Zealand for a case study. We have completed one in Australia already, but we are looking for another case study at the moment in New South Wales and Victoria. So if you're interested in a case study in either New South Wales or Victoria, please shout out. Case studies are typically at a neighbourhood scale, so about 1 square kilometre. So they're not intended to be for a full LGA, it's really a neighbourhood scale within an LGA. We're also exploring case studies for the UK and Europe, and also the United States and Canada. And then I mentioned before that national report that we're doing. If you do have an interest in receiving further information about that, feel free to email us at tpp@edgeenvironment.com, and we'll keep your details down for when we release that report coming into Christmas. So that's it in terms of the presentation. So Jenny, how about we work our way through the questions that are coming up?
So we've had a couple of questions come through while we've been chatting. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop them into the chat or the Q&A. So Tanya from City of Adelaide was wondering if we've considered if trees tend to grow differently in urban compared to suburban areas by any chance. I guess my thought on that would be that really comes down to that customization part of it when we're working with you in workshops. And you can even, you know, we've talked about breaking up the analysis into local government, state government and private, but really that breakdown of analysis could be to any sort of parcel boundaries that you are interested in. So it could be your urban, your high density versus your suburban areas, for example. Mark, would you have other comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question, Tanya, and thanks for tuning in today. We had this very discussion regarding Sydney recently. So noting that, you know, trees that are growing in the centre of City where they're surrounded by lots of hard infrastructure, their rates of growth, unless they're really well cared for and set up in something like a strata cell, their rates of growth are going to be much different than if they're growing, say, for example, in a wide verge out in a suburban street. And as Jenny said, that's why we've enabled that customizable feature for the tool, so we can start to allow for different rates of growth, even for similar types of trees.
Then another question from Joanne, who's joining us from City of Stirling over in WA, is wondering about potential missing criteria around the feasible amount of plantable space in each zone. And it's probably something we've glossed over and haven't gone into too much detail, but one of the inputs in terms of the area of interest comes down to sort of how much plantable space is in each of those areas of interest. So we do consider that, and you rightly point out that if you've got sort of medium or high density housing, it's going to be very difficult potentially to achieve a canopy cover. Mark, any other comments there?
Oh, look, I think it's a great observation. And once again, it's one of the reasons we were so keen to develop the tool in the way we have, Joanne. So is to be able to start to build the evidence base around this question. So if we were to say there was a lot of medium density land and there's really limited opportunity for increasing canopy cover there, we'd look at what's the full area of an LGA. Let's carve out that medium density land, and then let's just focus on how much land is left and what type of canopy increase could you achieve in that area. And I think that's a really important discussion to be able to have, because often we're setting ambitious targets without always considering the amount of plantable space. And you know, the time is now to be able to have that, I suppose, a stronger evidence base behind the discussions in setting future canopy cover targets.
Yeah. And Joanne also makes a comment that the larger trees are really only useful if they're allowed to become large and aren't pruned back, which is completely, yes, we agree.
It's another great question, Joanne. And one of the things we're also looking at the moment is how can you combine the sort of tools we've been discussing here with looking at overhead power lines? And are there options for having different types of overhead power lines that may enable trees to basically grow up through those power lines? So rather than having to have that awful look of a heavily pruned back tree below a power line, so a big tree becomes a small tree, is look at how to let it reach its full size by accounting for what's overhead. So a couple of great comments there.
Mark Hannon from City of Charles Sturt here in South Australia asked, have we considered including infill development scenarios into the modelling? So Mark, do you want to take that one?
I thought you were going to have a go at that one, Jenny. I'm happy to.
Yeah, I mean, my point of view is that really comes down to, you know, how we build in the scenarios and what's going to be achievable in each of the zones that we break up the modelling into.
Yeah, that's right, Jenny. And g'day, Mark, and thanks for joining us. So, you know, the way I look at doing this is, you know, we've flagged there that we've got the ability to factor in different tenures. In reality, though, what could be done is to say how much land do we have of different development types or different development densities, and then what is a reasonable target within each of those areas. So, you know, it may be that where we've got heavy infill, we say we're actually not going for a 20-25% canopy cover. We're going for something much, much lower. So rather than treating it as one single uniform landscape, is to break it up into little chunks, and then the modeling's done on those chunks.
Okay, that's all the questions we have at the moment, unless anyone's got some burning questions that they'd like to, oh yes, Mark, can this be done with the current tool? So is segmenting the land?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's all around agreeing to the number of different, I suppose, parcels of land. So we need to determine, what's the area associated with it, those different types of development zones. And you would end up running multiple scenarios. So it may end up being that rather than running just one version of the tool, you might have a couple on the go. But that's all doable. Yeah. I think, Mark, they're great questions as well. And it reflects the way the tool has developed up until now is it started off much, much more simple than what it currently is. And as we've gone by, people have said, love where you're going to, but can you do A, B, and C? And generally the answer's been yes. It's just a matter of working out how to do it. And I remember a discussion with a water-sensitive urban design colleague who single-handedly encouraged us to include the irrigation feature, which really that irrigation feature is not just active irrigation. It can actually be, if we look at it from a passive irrigation perspective as well.
Mark, Tanya's just asked a question about have we or could we consider different climate change scenarios for future modelling?
Yeah, great question, Tanya. Thanks for asking. The way we would tackle this at the moment is we would look at a given type of tree stock, or for our certain planting regime, what do we believe the impact of climate change will be on the future growth of that canopy? So we'd actually modify the tree growth parameters. So a lot of the way we deal with this comes back to how we modify those tree growth parameters. So we might look, for example, and Tanya, obviously knowing that you're from Adelaide, we'd look at the future climate for somewhere like Adelaide, work with ARB teams or horticulture teams to say, how does the proposed planting mix, what's its current future canopy? And then you can look at climate analogues to say, how would that similar mix of trees look under a different future climate? So this is very much designed to be a landscape scale analysis. I think there are also some interesting discussions to be had around how we work in with a tool like which plant where, which I know is close to being developed.
I think one of the common themes around sort of our responses to these questions really points out one of the strengths, I think, of the tool, which is that it's so customizable to your specific context and the scenarios you want to investigate, which makes it highly flexible. And, we can run any number of scenarios to help sort of investigate different potential futures, be it climate futures or development futures or planting mixes, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and we mentioned this a little bit earlier on, Jenny, but one of the advantages of that is that it makes it much less of a black box. And I know many of us around the call will have experienced working with tools where you think, how on earth is this actually working? And why is it spitting out the numbers that it does? And while we don't provide access to the formulas to sit in the back of the tool, that's mainly so that it's not possible to get in there and actually mess up the formulas. The way that the formulas are set up and the way they're designed around this multipartite analysis is something we're very clear and transparent about.
So there's a few more minutes. If there's no more questions, or I guess if we're sort of finish up, if you have any other questions, feel free to send an email to us directly or to the TPP at Edge email that's on the screen there, and we'd be happy to answer them outside of the webinar or even set up a meeting to discuss further with you as well.
And Jenny, I think there was a question there from, was it Joanne over in WA about a case study? We had actually been thinking about a case study in the West. It just hadn't been right at the top of the list, but if that's something you'd be interested in exploring, more than happy to have a chat.
I think that was not so much a question from Joanne, but me suggesting, because we were saying a New South Wales and a Victoria case study. Knowing Joanne's joining us from WA, we'd also be happy to chat if they were interested in a case study there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming along. Really appreciated the interaction. It's always a little bit different when you don't have people speaking and taking questions, but enjoyed the questions coming through the chat as well. Hope you all have a great remainder of your day.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone. Bye.